Today I'll be talking to you about the wood tracking system that is being employed by the Guyana Forestry Commission. And I suppose it may sound like a very elaborate system where you track the source of timber. But let me say the system of itself comprises of field and office procedures that uses information for tracking the movement of wood. It is tracking back all the way to the source. And when we talk about the source, we're talking about the actual stump where the log would have originated. You may also be curious to find out how can that be done. Well, it's simply done by a set of procedures which includes monitoring, which includes field data, which also includes having key critical points identified within the supply chain and monitor those chains. It ensures that the integrity of wood being harvested can be traced back to its origin, and also we should note here when we speak of origin, we're talking of legal origin. I would say that without such a system, it would be virtually impossible for any checks and balances that are remotely located to determine whether the timber that is being transported can be verified against the source. And that is why the system is so important, because you can agree with me that it's a very vast resource out there. I'm talking about the timber resources, given the landmass of Guyana and the kind of infrastructure that we have out there. It's virtually impossible to monitor every single stump before it's being harvested. Therefore, this system is being put in place to do such in a more effective way, given the resources that are at hand. Now, in continuing, I want to say that while it begins at the stump, it doesn't end until the timber of itself is disposed of by way of sale, and that means locally or export-wise. So it's a complete system, and this is the system which we call the chain of supply. The wood tracking system, to note here, is part of a more elaborate and complex arrangement which is called the legality assurance system. It's just a component, but I think I would rather say is the backbone of such a system, the legality assurance system. And it applies to all timber being transported out of prescribed boundaries, whether it be state forests, state land, or private land. Along that supply chain, as I mentioned earlier, critical control points have been identified. The first and most important critical control point is to ensure that the legal rights to harvest has been established prior to any extraction. Once that has been established, in certain cases, and I will go into that a little more in my production here, in certain cases you have to have a stock inventory. Now that inventory clearly identifies the standing stock of various species at the required 35 centimeter diameter, which is the legal limit to harvest. Once you have that, those 3 locations would be mapped and would be laid out for approval by the Guyana Forestry Commission. With those approval, you are then given the right to go and extract. In other cases, in areas such as agricultural leases, mining leases, and even private property, you do not require that system of inventorizing the standing stock. But we'll go into that a little bit more. But for now, let's talk about the one that requires the inventory. Once that is done, we then go to tree felling, which is considered another critical control point. From tree felling, we then go into production. Now that production means the forest production. From there, the logs will be transported. Now there are cases where logs can be confiscated. That is considered another control point, and we will elaborate further on that also. But once we have cleared the forest production checks and balances, we then need to monitor what we call the processing or the sale of the forest produce. So this is where it leaves what we call the upstream level of operation, and it now enters into the downstream aspect, which could be the processing, or it could be the actual sale of the raw material, which is the logs. That is another critical control point. From there on, we're looking at the actual disposal, which could be through the domestic market or through the export market. And here again, the export market has several checks and balances, which I'll touch on a bit later. I would further add here that there are instances where we have imported wood.
As it relates to the import, all importers of a timber product will know that they require to have the necessary approval from NAPO, that is the National Plant Protection Organization. And so the GRA will, once again, look for the approval before your documentations are processed. It's a simple process when it comes to the Guyana Revenue Authority. Once you have the necessary licensing and approval in place, we are prepared to process your documents.
Throughout all these critical control points, we have the in-transit checks and balances, which are not specific locations, but they are the movements between one point to the next. We also have systems in place to do those checks and balances. Now, let's go back to the issue of the legal right to harvest. And I would now expand a bit on the different types of areas where we would expect timber to be sourced from. Under the state forests, we have several concessions. We have what we call large concessions and small concessions. This is being monitored directly under the mandate of the Guyana Forestry Commission. Outside of those areas, we then have state land areas. And these would include Amerindian villages, sorry, not Amerindian villages, mining properties, agricultural leases, and in addition to that, we have a third category, which are private lands. And these are now the Amerindian lands or other types of private lands. So these are the locations that we have recognized as source of timber. Sources of timber. Now, for the state forest areas, as I mentioned earlier, you have to do what we call stock inventory. From those stock inventory, we establish what we call the 100% pre-harvest maps, 100% pre-harvest cutting lists. This applies to the large concessions, the timber sales agreement and the wood cutting leases. For the state forest permission, there are other controls in place, which I'll touch on a little bit later. But coming out of the stock map, each tree location is given a unique tree number. That tree is identified within a specific area, which is known as a block, a harvesting block. Each harvesting block carries a unique number that will not be repeated in any other location within that concession area. So here you see we are already tying the tree or the source of the timber down to a specific location, which can be described and which can be monitored. And as I'm on the subject of monitoring, once that stock map has been prepared, the GFC has to go and verify that a proper inventory was done, following all the methodology that are required, and the quality of data is up to standard. And this is where they go and do a 2.5% of every single harvesting block that is intended for harvest. They would do that to the extent where it's done at a random, using a random methodology. And in verifying that, if there's a certain discrepancy out of a tolerance level, those blocks will not be approved. Provided those blocks are within the tolerance level, it will be approved. Once that is done, then a report is submitted to the Guyana Forestry Commission head office for further review and to ensure that it's in keeping with the annual operational plan and the forest management plan. So here you see we haven't even harvested a single tree as yet, but there are already checks and balances that have to be done before we can enter that forest area. Now that we have the letter of approval to go and harvest each of the block that has been identified, or even if we have a state forest area where we do not require the inventory, then you still have to go through that process where the GFC will determine what you will be approved to harvest. Now, here it is important to point out the wood tracking system addresses the issue, the environment, one of the key environmental issues of sustainable forest management, which is to ensure you do not over-harvest, over-exploit the resources to a point where it is not sustainable. So once the inventory is done and the tagging is done for the tree location, the GFC then determines whether to apply what we call the annual allowable cut, which is a predetermined system based on the sealer system where it allows 20 cubic meter per hectare to be harvested over a 6-year cycle. Whether they will apply that or they will examine the inventory data to determine whether it meets that minimum requirement of the annual allowable cut. If not, then what the inventory data reveals is what will be used to limit the volume that can be removed. And that concept is called maximum allowable cut. So to simplify it for you, if using the sealer system provides a lower extraction volume, that is applied. If using the maximum allowable cut, which is from the inventory data, provides a lower extraction volume, then that is applied. So the lowest of the two will be applied. Here you might say that this is not useful for production purposes, but you have to imagine that you're there not only for that year of harvest, but you will want to return after the cycle has elapsed to continue your business of harvesting, and that is why it's critical. It may not seem very friendly in this current period, but coming on the next cycle, you will be happy you did that. So you have a residual stock that can sustain a long-term operation. So I know that this is a general issue that affects a lot of the operators. They complain that the quota is too low, but there is a reason for that quota. Can you imagine not having a quota and allowing extraction beyond a certain limit? Then naturally the next round of harvesting will find itself uneconomical. So once that is determined, the extractable volume is determined, then the GFC will issue tags based on the estimated volume per tree. So in some cases it could be one tree will give you 3 cubic meters per hectare. In other cases, because it varies as per area, it may give you 2.5 cubic meter. So looking at the volume, the GFC then decides how many tags to give you. And once you have those tags, that essentially is when you are actually given the right to go and start cutting. At the time of tree felling, we need to record the geographical location of each tree prior to cutting. Now, bear in mind, when you do an inventory, you may determine 300 trees have been found in this block, but you may not want to harvest all 300 for various reasons. Maybe markets are not available for certain species. Maybe when you go back, certain areas are not accessible due to flooding. So there may be various reasons. So it is never expected that you will take every single tree. So therefore, you have to identify to the GFC, out of the 300 trees, let's say in this example, I have harvested only 250, and these are the location. That helps in terms of traceability, and you will understand that as we go forward. And here again, I want to highlight the legal limit of harvest is 35 centimeters at diameter at breast height. There are cases where companies will opt to go to higher diameter limits, choose for various reasons, maybe recovery, maybe market demands, maybe certain species are better at certain sizes, but never below 35 centimeters per diameter. And another point to highlight here, because this is critical, is that you're not allowed to cut trees that were not marked initially in the block maps, in the stock maps. For that to be done, special permission has to be sought. So here you're seeing that even within a block that has been approved, that has tags, for care and precaution has to be taken, because it could be deemed that you're cutting an unauthorized standing tree. So all of this, to me, I would say personally, it seems very tedious, but it becomes very mundane once you start to do it the right way. And this is often the challenge with many operators, is that doing it the right way the first time is never something that should be taken for granted. Because if you imagine have to go back now and redo blocks that weren't done properly, or you didn't identify all the commercial trees, maybe your team didn't do a good job, you also have to have checks and balances in place to verify that they're doing a good job. And therefore, you will avoid any delays, any unnecessary cost, or the most unwelcome is breaches. Now, all of this is within what they call Code of Practice for Timber Harvesting. This is all captured within that document, which is the recommended practice. Now remember, the code is there for a purpose. The code is to take everything in a holistic form. So this is just a component of the code. And here it is talking a lot about the environmental aspect. Now, while we're on tree felling, maybe I should touch on the private properties, which do not have any sorts of limit in terms of volume, because most of these areas will undergo some sort of clear felling. In the normal forest operation in state forests, there is no type of clear felling being done, and that is a perception out there which we need to clarify. It's all selective harvesting, and you would appreciate how selective it is, given what I've described earlier about identifying the tree before you harvest it and the different checks and balances. But in the private areas, in the agricultural leases, the mining permits, the private lands, there is really no limit to the size of tree you can cut, the species you can cut, the volumes you can cut. And that also is monitored very closely. Despite there is that open window to do extraction at any level you wish, there is still checks and balances, because we have ways and means of verifying whether 10 tags can give you 10 cubic meter or 30 cubic meter. They have ways and means of verifying. So it's not a system which becomes less rigid in the private areas or the non-state forest areas. Now, I want to backtrack again, because we were talking about felling, and at the point of felling, once that tree is felled, and it's going to be removed either in the form of a log or in the form of lumber, there are tags. The GFC tag has to be affixed to the stump, and a corresponding number has to be affixed to either the log that is being removed, or if it's chainsaw lumber, for example, it has to be affixed to one piece of that lumber. And in transporting that lumber, we need to maintain the integrity of that set of pieces of lumber that would have originated from that stump. So right there and then is where I would say is the first point of affixing a unique number to that tree that is going to now be extracted away from its stump and end up somewhere in the supply chain, and therefore we need to find a traceability. And remember, here we now having a tag number and we having a geographical location. That location, which is read by a GPS, is also unique. So it helps to match location and number. Now, in some operations, you have central, what we call scaling points. In other operations, you may have several of those scaling points. In some cases, we call it a log market. So scaling is being done at the log market. In other cases where it might be centralized, where several log markets may be feeding into one, it's called a stumping point. Now, either of those locations where measurements will be done. And those measurements are against individual pieces. And each piece will carry that tag number that I mentioned. It will carry the block number that it came from. It will also carry the species, and there's where you take the volume. So this is now giving birth. You know, it's like giving birth to a child. The child is born, and then you go through the process of getting a birth certificate. So this is now the information that's going to develop for that individual piece of log to create what we will say the birth certificate for that piece of log. Now, there are instances where one log has to be cut into two parts for logistics reasons. It is a requirement of the GFC that you will write the GFC tag number that apply to the very first piece. So there is a duplication, or sometimes triplications, depending on how many pieces comes out of one piece of log. So there is no time that any piece of log or any excuses should be given that, oh, we do not have a number for this log because it was a second cut. You are required to write the GFC number on that second cut. And again, put the block number. So all pieces should be accounted for at all times. Now, this is assuming that the scaling is being done within the boundaries of the concession. Now, whenever the log or lumber has to exit the boundaries of the concession, whether it was measured within the boundary or not measured within the boundary, it has to be declared on a GFC removal permit. In the case of the state forest, it's called a removal permit. In the case of private lands, it's called a private property declaration, removal declaration. In all cases, GFC tags have to be used. Once the tags are used, then on that removal permit is where you fill in details about the location that you're harvesting from, the name of the concession, the name of the private property. There might be a specific reference number for that location, a TSA number, a SFP number. You apply that, the date that you're removing that produce, what type of vehicle you're using, mode of transportation. It could be barges, it could be trucks, it could be tractors. And following that, you then have to list every single tag that was used, and against the species, the volume. So here is where we're writing up more or less the board certificate. Now we have the information, we know what type of log it is, we know the length, the volume, we know the tag number, so we apply it on the removal permit or the private property removal declaration. So at any point in the supply chain, any officer can stop that supply and ensure that legal rights were given to harvest and it's being transported using the required system. So in the absence of that document, it will create some amount of doubt, and the GFC will have no choice but to render that transport as a means for suspicion, because any legal person should have all those documents. So once suspicion arises, then it will be stopped, and there are some other systems that will take play, which I'll go into a little further. Now there are some cases where the movement of timber from the boundaries of the concession to the next critical control point cannot be accommodated by a removal permit, by a single document. And this applies for the large operations, where you may have within a month maybe 30, 40, 50 movements of logs by whatever means out of the boundary of the concession to the next critical control point, and therefore it will be impractical to apply the use of removal permits. In those cases, we have what we call a trip sheet, and that trip sheet is used against one single removal permit. So you may have 20 or 30 trip sheets that can apply to one removal permit. That allows for frequent movements, and at the end of it all, it has to reconcile with the removal permit. So it's not a means of circumventing the use of a removal permit, it's actually complementing the use of the removal permit to make it more practical. Because you can appreciate with such a large operation, there will be a lot of scaling being done at various locations. And it would not be that simple to use a removal permit for every location that the timber originates within a large concession. So the trip sheet applies. Now once a removal permit is used, it has to be declared to the forest, the closest GFC forest station within 24 hours of the timber arriving at that destination. Once that is done, the GFC will go and do checks against the removal permit to ensure that the information compares with the physical timber. In the cases of trip sheet, the same will be done, but as for the arrival of the produce. So you do not wait until the end of the month to go and declare your removal permit for 30, 40, 50 loads of timber at one go. is as for the arrival of the trip sheets at the destination, checks will be done. And it's important to point out that if that is done and done properly, and the operator requires to further transport that timber to another location, it might not be the final location, it might need to go now to a sawmill, it may need to go to the wharf for stuffing, for export. So it might be several other locations that need to go. There's another document that assists in that movement, because at no point we wish to see timber being transported and not accounted for in black and white. So there is what we call the transshipment permits. This is just as critical as a removal permit, except it says that the timber has been checked off already by a forest officer and is now being permitted for further transport in. So it is just as important, but it comes after the removal permit. And that can be allowed for several locations. So you may have, let's say, a truckload of logs arriving at a specific location with a removal permit, but that truckload of log will be further broken up into several locations. You know, it may have to go to 2 or 3 different sawmills or lumber yard. There's where you can use 2 or 3 trip sheets that will refer back to that single permit. So it's a very accommodating piece of document to make the logistics a lot more easier in terms of accountability. And quite similar, as I mentioned, we have the private property removal declaration. Now, we have a similar system where you can have a document that can be used for the transport and once it has been declared afforestation. And that is what I believe is called the clearance pass. Now, at all stages of the chain of supply up to that point that I've touched on, which is the first point of check-in by the GFC officer, the GFC will do spot checks. And those spot checks can be at the destination, it could be along the way, or it could be at the stop. So at every stage of the operations, you have to have, and this is very critical for private sector operators, that you must have people that are competent enough to manage this chain of supply. Not just the physical chain of supply, but the record-keeping aspect of it, because you can be questioned along the way. And going through the entire legality assurance system, you will understand why is it important. And I think that will be touched on in another presentation. Now let's talk about confiscated timber, because you heard me mention that if suspicion arises, anyway along that chain of supply, the GFC has all legal right to inquire. Now that inquiry can take two forms. The first form could be that maybe the GFC has little doubt about the legality of the timber in terms of the source or whether the right documentation was used. In those cases, the GFC may allow the operator to retain access to the timber under their care until the investigation is completed. In those cases, the GFC will issue what they call a custody form, which simply says it's in your safe custody until a final decision. It doesn't mean it's yours, but it stays in your custody until a final decision is determined on its legality or whatever recourse the GFC sees necessary in consultation with the operator. Then the other form is that the GFC is not convinced that it should be left in your care, or it may not be convenient at the time for the GFC to take possession. It may be convenient at the time for the GFC to take possession of the timber, and in that case, they will give you a seizure form. Here is where the GFC is stating, and you will be having a copy, that the timber has been suspected of some sort of a breach, and we are taking possession of it, but we are recording that we are taking this timber from you. So at a later date, whatever recourse is taken, you are assured that GFC has acknowledged taking this timber from you. Now, whether it be in custody, whether it be on the seizure, a decision has to be made. And that decision has to be made by GFC in consultation with the operator. In most cases, there will be a settlement. And we have one of two options of settling. One is through the courts, or the other option is by way of a compensation to the state for whatever breaches. Or I should mention there's a third option where there was there was no breaches found, and you're allowed to have access to the timber. But assuming the case of compensation, once that is paid, then the produce will then re-enter what we call the legal chain of supply. For that to be done, you have to have a clearance pass, because you remember your documents would have been confiscated along with the produce, whether on the seizure or custody. So a new document has to be used, and that document will state clearly the produce that has been released and in whose name. So it gets back into the system. Now, let's go to what may be considered one of the more complex side of the chain of supply, which is processing. I know many of you will want to know, how can you trace timber when it changes form from log to lumber or to veneer or to plywood? Because it goes into so many parts. How is it traceable? You don't have a tag, you don't have a number you can put in each piece. How is it done? Now, we have designed a system which I would say is still under review, but it has been applied in several operations. And we do have some companies that are currently being independently monitored by international auditors to verify that they can manage the system. And there are a few companies that are already certified in this regard. So we have examples to improve the system. But once it enters any processing site, whether it be a veneer factory, a plywood factory, or a sawmill, there are certain recording that has to be done. Now remember, no produce should arrive at any processing site without the legal document, which should be a removal permit, a transshipment, a private property removal declaration. So no processing site should be accepting that. Any produce without those documents. Once you have those documents, there is a prescribed register which you have to enter make that entry for the delivery of that timber, whether it be in logs or be in lumber. And there are clear information that has to be inserted there, such as the location, such as the name of the supplier, the volume, the tag numbers, the date, and those registers are being checked on a regular basis by the Guyana Forestry Commission to ensure no processing site is accepting timber that cannot be traced back to its origin by way of the removal documents. And at the end of the month's production of any processing site, you have to submit what we call returns. Now in those returns, the GFC can determine through a very simple means of calculating recovery whether you had a higher input than the output that you're getting, or a low input being declared but a higher output is being declared. Output meaning in whatever finished form we're talking about, lumber, plywood, or veneer. So there's a way of determining whether you were accepting timber that was not legal in the system, and then the output will show it's very high and abnormal, so there's a recovery calculation that can be done. So it's a good check and balance, I would say. Now, in other cases where you may not take it to a processing site, but you might sell it in the form that it is in, there again, any buyer must foresee that you are declaring your timber on an approved GFC document. Once that is done, the buyer is free to buy. Now, there's one point I missed here that I should talk about, is that no timber should enter any processing site or offer for sale unless it has been branded by the Guyana Forestry Commission. Branded meaning it was checked by an officer, and they have placed an hammer mark which says that this was checked, verified, and is deemed okay for further processing or sale. So no processing site should have unmarked timber, whether logs or lumber, at their ramp for further processing, or no buyer should agree to buy any timber without that hammer mark. So that is very important, because later you could purchase it and then you are caught in the situation of answering for something that you have little knowledge of. So providing you are satisfied as a buyer, as a sawmiller, you will then be issued a bill of sale. Now that bill of sale can be used by you if you have to further transport to another location. So maybe you may go and buy just at the gate of the forest concession. You buy it there, and you can then use a bill of sale to forward the transport, because the GFC, obviously, the likelihood of them stopping you along the way is fairly high, and therefore you can show, look, I bought this from X concessionaire, and they will then go with that information to verify an actual sale of that sort was done. So in the monthly submission is where everything will be summarized, and as I'm referring here about the processing site, it will be summarized and checks will be done there again. In the cases of export, where you may want to export directly, there is another set of procedures you have to go through. The very first is applying for the approval to export. And at that very stage is where you have to declare the source documents. The removal permits that would have been used, you have to declare that, along with tag numbers, the name of the supplier. So all of this will then be used by the GFC to verify that this was timber that was harvested and declared and verified by GFC prior to this application for export. Once that application is done, the GFC will expect you to have an independent grader, because you want to ensure that timber leaving Guyana, if it is being sold as a particular product, it meets that requirements. Otherwise, we will tarnish the image of Guyana, and therefore we need to manage what leaves Guyana. So if you're saying you're selling lumber of a certain description, that should be verified by an independent inspector. And he will then decide if he agrees with that it meets the requirements, and he will apply a hammer mark to say, I have checked and I'm satisfied. And he will sign up a document which is called a timber marketing certificate. That timber marketing certificate is then submitted to GFC. They will then send an inspector of their own to do 100% checks to ensure what the grader has done is accurate and acceptable. And from there, you will have approval for that produce to export. Now, it doesn't end there. You now have to go to the Customs Authority and uplift the C-72 form. That C-72 form is a mandatory form which is used for all exports across Guyana. And that form, accompanied with the application for approval for export, accompanied with the timber marketing certificate which has been signed off by a GFC timber inspector, you will then apply to ship at a particular date on a particular vessel and other descriptions that apply. The GFC will ensure that all documents that up to that point of C-72 has been done in a proper way, and there will be two authorizing signatures that will be applied to that C-72 form, stamped by GFC, that will then be taken to the Customs Authority. Now, there's no way you can take a C-72 form to the Customs Authority without that stamp and signature and the accompanying documents. So in other words, timber cannot leave Guyana unless the GFC gives the approval.
Anyway, the Guyana Revenue Authority's part in the NTWG is basically as processing agency for all imports and export declaration. So any importer or exporter of a timber product will need to have the necessary approval and documentation from the Guyana Forestry Commission prior to them presenting the documents, which is the C-72, to our Customs Department of the Guyana Revenue Authority for processing prior to the exportation. If I could give a little background in terms of the documents needed for the exportation, you need the C-72, you'll need the export certificate, and you need your application to export, all of which needs to be signed, stamped, and sealed by the Guyana Forestry Commission. I think with the EU flag it will be no different. In this case there will be a certificate, and therefore before we process your documents at the Guyana Revenue Authority, we will definitely look for that certificate, which must be issued. And so all exporters will be reminded once this process has been implemented to ensure that they have a copy of that certificate to be attached to the declaration before they bring it in for processing.
An important point to note is that once GFC is satisfied that the C-72 and its accompanying documents were done appropriately, there are certain taxes to be paid, which is called export levy. export levy is dependent on the product and dependent on the species. And there are certain percentages. The GFC will calculate that. And once it's paid, a receipt will be issued and accompany that C-72 form, which provides evidence that you have paid all your requisite fees to the Guyana Revenue Authority, who is the approving authority for the actual export of that product in whatever form it may be in. Now, you would have heard a handful of information about the tracking system. And you may say, wow, this is very elaborate, and I think this is very impossible for me to use or to comply with. And some of you may even say, oh, this is a whole new system. Well, let me put your fears to rest. This system has been working since the year 2000 and has gone through several reviews. So we're in the year 2015, we're talking 15 years already it has been tried and tested. So it's not new. Let me answer that clearly. However, it is now going to be recognized not only by Guyana, but it's going to be recognized by international bodies. So we have to ensure it runs smoothly, efficiently, effectively, with a high degree of accountability. So the only thing that might be new upon new is that you have to be more accountable. And in any natural resources sector, which internationally has a lot of scrutiny, this is expected. So it's not a new system. It's something we've been doing on a daily basis, but we may need to be a little more accountable for it. And I want to stress the point here is that you need to have competent individuals that can manage the system for you, because it's absolutely necessary. It's not going to bring any further burden on you. What it's going to bring is actually, I think, greater benefit to your business, because you yourself cannot be at every aspect of the chain of supply. But this kind of documentation helps you to manage your business, because I can tell you it's a massive infrastructure out there, and your own timber could be ending up in the hands of other operators, and I'm sure you don't want that. Your timber is being secured by the use of this kind of documentation and checks and balances. Because we know, I mean, we're all in the business, we know sometimes you can step over in another person's boundary, but he cannot get your tags, he cannot get your removal permit. So he'll be making a false claim, which some way along the chain of supply he may be caught. No, that is a protection for you. So don't see it as a burden, see it as added value to your business, giving you the comfort that your people on the ground, once they comply, they'll be moving your timber. They'll be protecting your timber. They'll be answering for your timber. So do not see it as a burden. So I know it might sound elaborate, but as I say, with practice, it will become easier. And I think the best thing, whenever there is doubt, rather than you commit yourself by writing something you're not certain about, you go to a forest station, the closest one to you, and seek clarifications, because once you put your signature or your information on those documents, you will be held accountable against that information. So if there are any doubt along the way, you may have some suspicion that your guys didn't do a good job, maybe the best thing to do is go to Forestry Force and go through whatever procedures required to correct that mistake that may have existed, rather than believing that you can pass the entire system and not be caught. And there are cases where delivery has been done already, but GFC can still come back and verify whether it was a legal supply. So don't ever believe that maybe I stand a chance of not being caught. Just do it the right way the first time, and there should be no problems. Thank you.